I've been fortunate to watch her career develop in India, and on top of a very distinguished career as a lawyer in London, and an interest in law, communications, and privacy, and internet policy. And this year, she's been amazingly traveled. She was in Montevideo and in Armenia and Azerbaijan.
Wow.
That's terrible to confuse the two. You can get lynched for less in either place. But at any rate, today, she's been working on extremely important questions of privacy or privacy, Indian policy, etc. And I'm sure that it'll be great for all of us. So thank you very much, Malavika.
Hi. So one of the things that's been really bothering me in India recently is the shackles that have been put on the internet. So I actually wore this very symbolically, but I was asked to remove it so I don't get electrocuted during the talk. So that's kind of one of the, I put panoptification in the title mainly because I like playing with words and subverting them, but it's kind of, the reason I put it in there was I find this one of the best analogies to actually describe what's going on in India. And 1984 had already been taken. For me, actually, 2012 is the biggest year recently in terms of all the events that have been happening in India. But I think Orwell cornered the market on titles with numbers in them. So this is one of my favorite ads about surveillance. So this was one of the quotes that actually made me sort of link a lot of themes that I've been working on together. Not that I read Foucault before breakfast, but this was something that struck a real chord with me because I've been working on issues of privacy. I've also been looking at free speech and internet policy, and they all seem to come together in something like this, where the Indian government seems to have a huge interest in making the citizen identified and visible to the state. And my PhD is actually on the biometric ID card, so identification and identity is something I'm really interested in. And coupled with all the battles that have been going on in the free speech area, this really resonated with me. And can we put one of the videos on, the pizza one? Is it in here? When I try to talk to people in India about privacy and security, I find their eyes glaze over because I am a lawyer and I do talk about the law. The video. Sorry. But I found that the most effective way to actually communicate, no, the other one, communicate things to people is using this video. This actually makes it personal, it brings it home to them. And this is something that the ACLU did a few years ago. It was about ordering pizza. I'm not sure if everyone has seen it, but this is the thing that actually makes people wake up in India when I do talks about this. They don't care about the law, they don't care about privacy or security, but you show them this and they think, oh my God, is that what's going to happen to me? So I'll just show you the video very quickly.
You'd have in 30 minutes, or it's free. This is Mary. May I take your order?
Hi, Mary. Yes, I'd like to order.
Pizza Palace, guaranteed hot in 30 minutes, or it's free. This is Mary. May I take your order?
Hi, Mary. Yes, I'd like to order.
Is this Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Thank you for calling again, sir. I show your national identification number is 610-204-999-8-45-54610. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. I see you live at 736 Montrose Court, but you're calling from your cell phone. Are you at home?
I'm just leaving work, but I'm...
Oh, we can deliver to Bob's Auto Supply. That's at 175 Lincoln Avenue, yes?
No, I'm on my way home. How do you know all this stuff?
We just got wired into the system, sir.
Oh, well, I'd like to order a couple of your double meat special pizzas.
Sure thing. There'll be a new $20 charge for those, sir.
What do you mean?
Sir, the system shows me that your medical records indicate that you have high blood pressure and extremely high cholesterol. Luckily, we have a new agreement with your national health care provider that allows us to sell you double meat pies as long as you agree to waive all future claims of liability.
What?
Do you agree, sir? You can sign the form when we deliver, but there is a charge for processing. The total is $67 even.
$67?
Well, that includes the delivery surcharge of $15 to cover the added risk to our driver of traveling through an orange zone.
I live in an orange zone?
Now you do. Looks like there was another robbery on Montrose yesterday. You could save $48 if you ordered our special Sprout Submarine combo and picked it up yourself. Comes with tofu sticks. Those are very tasty, sir. Good value, too.
But I want double meat.
Well, I'm sure you can afford the $67 then. You just bought those tickets to Hawaii. They weren't cheap, eh? Oh, but I see you checked out the budget beach bum at the library last week. Up to you, sir.
All right. I'll get the Sprout subs.
Good choice, sir. Gotta watch that waist if you're hitting the beach, eh? 42 inches. Wow. Man, I'd say tofu and sprouts is like required.
That's how much?
Just between you and me, there's a $3 off coupon in this month's Total Men's Fitness magazine. Your wife Betty subscribes to that, right? Anyhow, clip that and it's $19.99 even. Whoa, looks like you maxed out on all your credit cards. Bring cash, okay?
Want to stop this from happening?
Are you going to describe the India policy?
Yeah,
Because
I am, yeah.
people may not know everything.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
what they want.
So can I just show the other video? So the reason that I wanted to show this was the contrast with how people care about stuff like this in India. And this is from a recent Kannada movie, which is in Karnataka where I live. And we think we can have ID cards and we think we can have e-governance schemes that use a lot of personal data. But this is also the culture that we're living in, where these kind of things are possible.
Hey, ನೋಡವನ್ನ ಯಾವನೋ ಕಳ್ಳ
ಸರ್ ಇವನು ಕದಿಯೋಕೆ ಬಂದಿದ್ದಾನೆ ಅಂತ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಹೇಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು ಸರ್?
ಕದಿಯೋಕ್ ಬಂದಿರೋರೆ ಲೂಸ್ ತರ ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ನೋಡೋದು. ಅವನ್ನೇ ಫಾಲೋ ಮಾಡು. ಈ ಕ್ಯಾಮ್ರಾ ಅವನ್ನೇ ಸೀದಾ ಫಾಲೋ ಮಾಡ್ತಾ ಇರ್ಲಿ. ಜೂಮ್ ಹಾಕು. ಜುಮಾಕು ಇದು ಈ ಕೇಸ ನೋಡು. ಇವನು ಕದಿಯಕ್ ಬಂದಿಲ್ಲಪ್ಪ, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಅಂತ ಕಾಣುತ್ತೆ. ಸಿಕ್ಕಾಪಟ್ಟೆ ನಾಚ್ಕೋತಾ ಇದ್ದಾನೆ. ಮಾತಾಡೋನೆ ಮಹಾಶೂರ.
ಅಮ್ಮ ಸಿಕ್ಕಿದಕ್ಕೆಲ್ಲ ಕೈ ಹಾಕ್ತೀಯ? ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ನಿನಗೆ. ಬಾ ನಡಿ ನಡಿ ನಡಿಯೋ. ಹಾಯ್ ವಿಶಾಲ್, ಅಮ್ಮ ಹೇಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ?
ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ.
ಏನೋ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ ಅವತಾರ, ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಗಡ್ಡ ಬಿಟ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮೊದ್ಲೋಗ್ ಬೋಳ್ಸು. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್
ಯಾರಪ್ಪ ಅಲ್ಲಿ? ಇದ್ರ ರೇಟ್ ಎಷ್ಟು ನೋಡಿ ಹೇಳು.
80.
1200. ಈ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ನಿಂದ ಫೋಟೋ ಯಾವಂದ ಇದೆ?
ಹೌದು, ನಮ್ಮಪ್ಪಂದು.
ನೋಡಪ್ಪ, ಇವತ್ತಿನ ಹುಡುಗರು ಅವ್ರ ಅಪ್ಪನ ದುಡ್ಡಲ್ಲಿ ಏನೇನ್ ತಗೊಳ್ತಾರೆ ಅಂತ ದುಡಿಯಕ್ ಬರ್ದೇ ಇದ್ರು ಗಡ್ಡ ಮೀಸೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಬಂದ್ಬಿಡುತ್ತೆ.
ಉಪ್ಪಿನಕಾಯಿ ನಂಚ್ಕೊಂತೀನಿ, ಚೆನ್ನಾಗೇ ಇರುತ್ತೆ.
ನೋಡೆ, ನಿನ್ನ ಮಗ ನನ್ನ ಕ್ರೆಡಿಟ್ ಕಾರ್ಡ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ 1200 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಖರ್ಚು ಮಾಡಿದಾನೆ. ಒಂದ್ ನಯಾ ಪೈಸಾ ದುಡಿಯಲ್ಲ. ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ತಡಿ ಅವನ್ಗೆ.
ಮನೆಗ್ ಬಂದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಮಾತಾಡೋದ್ರಾಯ್ತು, ಈಗ ಸುಮ್ನೆ ಊಟ ಮಾಡಿ.
ನಾನಿಲ್ಲ ಅನ್ನ ಸಾಂಬಾರಲ್ಲಿ ಸಾಯ್ತಾ ಇದ್ದೀನಿ, ಅವ್ನು ನನ್ನ ದುಡ್ಡಲ್ಲಿ ಮಜಾ ಮಾಡ್ಬೇಕಾ?
ಹಲೋ
ಅಪ್ಪ ತಂದೆ, 1200 ರೂಪಾಯಿಂದ ಏನ್ ತಗೊಂಡಿಯಪ್ಪ?
ಅಪ್ಪ ಅದು ಮನೆ ಸಾಮಾನು, ಅಕ್ಕಿ, ಅದೇನೋ ಗೋಧಿ, ಕೊತ್ತಂಬರಿ ಸೊಪ್ಪು, ಡಾಲ್ಡಾ, ಫ್ಯಾಂಟಾ, ಶುಂಠಿ, ಕಡ್ಲೆ, ಶೇಂಗಾ,
ಕಾಮಸೂತ್ರ.
ಅಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ 1200 ರೂಪಾಯಿ ಆಗತ್ತಾ?
ಅಪ್ಪ ಅದು ಅಪ್ಪ ಕಾಂಡಮ್ ತಗೊಂಡೆ ಅಪ್ಪ.
ಏನ
ಕಾಂಡಮ್ ಅಪ್ಪ. ಏಡ್ಸ್ ಹಾಗೂ ಪೋಲಿ ಮಕ್ಕಳ ಜನನ ನಿರ್ಮೂಲನೆಗೆ ಸಹಕಾರಿ. ನಾನಿವತ್ತು ಮನೆಗೆ ಬರ್ತಾ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಪ್ಪ. ಊಟ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಮಲ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಥ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಯು.
ಈ ವಿಡಿಯೋನ ತೆಗೆದು ನನ್ನ ಮೊಬೈಲ್ಗೆ ಹಾಕೋ, ಇಂಟರ್ನೆಟ್ಗೆ ಬಿಡೋಣ. ಒಳ್ಳೆ ಕಾಮಿಡಿ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ.
ಯಾಕ್ರಿ, ಏನ್ ತಗೊಂಡಂತೆ?
ಅದೇ ಅಡಿಗೆ ಸಾಮಾನು, ಕೊತ್ತಂಬರಿ ಸೊಪ್ಪು, ಅಕ್ಕಿ, ಗೋಧಿ.
So I mean, I mean, I was watching this video, weirdly sent to me by a computer science professor in America, but one of the things that struck me about it was, I mean, there were just so many shades of wrong, you know, kids photographing you, image rights being violated, surveillance cameras in a department store, the surveillance guys saying, let's put this on the internet, it'll be really fun, you know, people being able to use other people's credit cards, no problem with that, without photo ID. I mean, it has his dad's picture on it and they didn't care. Messages going to the wrong people. I mean, it was just so many shades of wrong that made me think, you know, in a lot of ways, there's a huge gap in India between law and policy and what actually happens on the ground. And to me, this video was a really fun way of showing how the gap is even bigger than policymakers would like to think. We've been having a lot of debates around privacy because with the ID card being rolled out, I don't know how much people know about the ID card, but it's already enrolled about 270 million people, which makes it the biggest biometric database already before it's even completed. And it's meant to cover everyone, not just citizens, residents as well. So anyone living in India can get one of these. And in order to protect against the fact that a lot of people have poor quality fingerprints from manual labor because it's supposed to be a socially inclusive program, because they have what the government calls poor quality fingerprints that don't show up well from being eroded through manual labor. They're taking all 10 fingerprints. They're also taking both iris scans, just in case the fingerprints don't work. And they have a photo ID, they have other demographic details. So when people keep saying this is going to be so great, it's going to transform social delivery, it could do those things, and there are people who argue for the good sides of the program, but as someone who actually has a particular bugbear when it comes to issues of privacy and security, I find the project really troublesome because of the several points of failure that there are. It's built as a public-private partnership, which sounds great because I think the private sector is better at actually delivering services and has a better understanding of technology than the government does. We have instances where if there are issues of cyber stalking, a policeman will come up and take the entire computer to the police station because they don't know how to find what they're looking for. So I think in that kind of a situation, it's great to have laws that protect data and privacy, but you also live in a culture where it's just not taken seriously. So one of the problems that we have is around security, and I think this cartoon from XKCD perfectly illustrates what would happen in India, because even if you get the technology right, even if the public-private partnership delivers, there's absolutely nothing to stop offline fraud and offline subversion, because I was talking to someone who's the police commissioner in our state, and he was actually saying you can have the best, you know, world standard technology, the best iris scanning technology, you can get broadband into villages, you can have devices use mobile, you can use all kinds of fantastic technology. There's nothing to stop the guy being beaten up and having his fingerprints dragged to the machine to actually give it. And there are iris scanners that, there are fingerprint scanners that would actually do thermal imaging and have them done in real time, so you could tell if a real person was doing it and not just a file that had been created earlier. But that's too expensive, so obviously we're not using it. So this police commissioner was telling me about how in our feudal system in a lot of villages, you have, you know, the local landlord actually go and, you know, make people get their benefits, their rations, their subsidies, different entitlements that they get, and actually walk with them, have them get the subsidies and then take a cut from that. There's nothing to stop that happening. They could still make the person go and put their fingerprint on there and still do the same kind of fraud.
One of the main goals was to cut out the corruption at the end and to change totally the distribution of benefits.
It is, but it doesn't cover the offline fraud that can take place.
Maybe that you should give a sense of the larger picture of, like, are you disagreeing with the goals of the system or just the implementation? Are you saying no implementation can achieve the goals that are set forth?
I think the implementation suffers. I think the goals of having identification are good because a lot of people suffer from not having any form of documentation. India is particularly bad at documenting births and deaths, and you know, a lot of people are homeless, they don't have property documents, or they're just illiterate, they don't have documents that evidence anything. So the idea of having some kind of ID that would actually make them mobile, which is recognized by the federal government as opposed to have it at a state level, is laudable. The problem is when they've architected it in the way that they have without the right security measures, and when it's also planned as the public-private partnership where people can actually enroll in a host of different agencies. So you can go to a bank, you can go to your insurance company, to a gas station, or different places that have signed up contracts with the government. And there are no laws that actually prevent them from keeping all of that data. So you go and enroll, they have the scanners, they collect all of your biometric data. Nothing requires them to actually delete it off their systems. So if you enroll through your bank, there's nothing that stops your bank actually using the data. So if you have one rogue employee who uses your biometrics to unlock your account, to transfer your funds to his account or to somewhere else, it's very hard to trace that. So I think there are problems with that. There are also problems because although the central government may be very committed to certain standards of privacy and security, when they flow down through the system, the guy on the ground who's actually collecting the data is either not aware or doesn't care, because he actually gets paid for per person that he enrolls into the system. So he has a conflict of interest, but he also doesn't know what the standards are, and he doesn't care. So we've actually had video footage of people who are doing this in the villages, and you walk up to them and say, what kind of data are you collecting? And they'll turn their computer screens around and go, here you go. Okay, so this guy, he has cancer. You want to know who his doctor is? Here's his mobile number. That's his mother's name. And no, that's her picture. God, she's ugly, isn't she? So he was sharing all kinds of data with us. And it wasn't like he thought he wasn't being recorded. He didn't see anything inherently sinister in this or anything wrong with this kind of thing. So one of the problems that we're facing in India is that this compulsion to record everyone and this compulsion to identify everyone, while it has some welfare goals behind it, can also risk that your informational privacy or transactional privacy is being compromised in many ways. Because even if the system is built such that it's only a number, and even if every time it logs the system for authentication, it just gives a yes/no answer. So it will ping the system and say, you're trying to fly somewhere and you need to identify yourself. It will just say, is this person who they say they are? It'll just use your fingerprint. But in doing that, there's a whole bunch of traffic that's built up. They know you were at Bombay Airport in the morning. They know you were taking money out of an ATM in the afternoon. They know you were doing a whole host of transactions because each device is authenticated with the system. So they can actually build a huge paper trail of what you've been doing. So that's one of the problems that there is. The other one is around harmonization, because the government has certain standards. Each of the enrollers use their own sort of standards in logging people and keeping the databases. Plus, in order to keep it all private and secure, the government has taken certain decisions around what kind of data can be collected. So we fought a lot to keep the fields down to about 8. But every government that wants to implement it or wants it to link to certain schemes goes, why are we only collecting 8? How about 50? We should actually ask them about their gender, about their gender is already included, but we should ask them about their ethnicity, we should ask them about their religion, we should ask them all kinds of other details that will be useful for us. So this can be hijacked for marketing purposes, it can be used to reveal a lot of information that shouldn't be. Plus, the ID number is meant to facilitate linkage across a whole host of databases. So we have something called the National Intelligence Grid, which is meant to collect and actually combine information that was kept in silos. So it's going to collect about 21 different databases. So it will have tax records, it will have police records, traffic information, health records, all kinds of things. The second you combine them, you can begin to see how frightening that is when decisions are being made about loans you can get, about entitlements you have, when information that should be kept private and that you have a right to maintain in what Helen Nissenbaum would call contextual integrity. You violate the contextual integrity of certain databases and the function for which it was willingly given when you're allowing function creep of this manner. The other kind of thing is, this is taking off from the Foucault point, but about different cages in which people are individualized, they're constantly visible. And he talks about this in the sense of prisons or hospitals and schools. But I found these three very, very useful, because if you're talking about enclosure, that enclosure now is not just your ID card or your number, but it's actually being linked to everything you do online and offline. So your boundaries are getting bigger, and the whole internet is becoming your enclosure or your bounded space. And we're trying to partition people in different ways. We're preventing them speaking to each other on Facebook. We're preventing them commenting on stuff, and also control of activity in terms of gesture, posture, and movement. I'm not going to go into the details of biometrics and the body and that whole trope, but in terms of movement and visibility of people. So this was the prison that, I mean, this was just not just the idealized prison, this was actually built in Cuba, but there are several prisons that can look like this, and I think the internet in India is beginning to look more and more like this. This was a quote, some of you may have seen this, this was a post that somebody put on Facebook. And it was in the context of one of the leaders in the political party having died. Ironically, this is someone who himself was responsible for all kinds of hate speech and inciting religious and communal tensions. All of Bombay came to a standstill, you know, because people were terrified of opening their shops and establishments in case, you know, there was a mob that would lynch them. So a schoolgirl wrote this, you know, just saying people die, you know, life needs to go on. It's fine, but she says people are staying away not out of respect, but out of fear. This is, yeah, and this is what happened to her next day. So one of the girls was the girl who actually posted it, and the other one was her friend. All her friend did was like the comment, and they were both arrested under the guidelines under our IT Act. And I'm not saying India is a better democracy or a better place to be than the Middle East, but these are images that I don't associate with India. I'm not used to seeing these pictures in my country. This was another case where a very well-known cartoonist, you know, did a lot of political cartoons, and there was a movement towards greater transparency and towards exposing corruption in India. And there was this whole thing about cartoons against corruption. And he had published a whole series of things. So the first one is where that's a depiction of the Indian Parliament, and he's looking at how all the polling booths are effectively flushing waste into our Parliament, and how this is in the context that we had a big right to read campaign, and he's talking about why the right to read is important, saying if you don't educate people and you don't make them literate, their democratic rights and the exercise of their polling is meaningless if you're sending trash into the Parliament. This was another one that he did, which was he did this whole series on national symbols. And he was talking, I mean, he was trying to make the point about how, you know, it's all symbolism and it's all emblems and how they're being ruined. And our national symbol is actually meant to have 4 lions on it. And underneath it talks about truth prevailing. So he changed it to say corruption rules instead of truth ruling. And he, you know, did it as a mass of hungry wolves, bloodthirsty wolves rather than lions. He was arrested as well on charges of sedition. These were some more of his cartoons. So in that same, you know, national symbols thing, that was a cartoon. So a neta is an Indian bureaucrat or politician, and the cap is symbolic of, you know, it's called a Gandhi cap even though Nehru wore it, but it's symbolic of not just a politician, but of a particularly inept, corrupt politician who doesn't do very much. So he called this big, and he thinks they're all dinosaurs because they don't grow, they don't evolve, they're trying to regulate the internet when they don't use it. And so he had this image of the national animal being the netasaur. And he also did this one, which was about how he's being beaten up for protesting against corruption. And he says, you know, first corruption hits me and then it doesn't let me cry. So when you try and actually be vocal about things and you actually try and protest, you get arrested. So he was actually arrested on charges of sedition, and he refused bail because he didn't think this was something that should be actionable under the sedition laws, but he also thought that free speech was such a big deal that he didn't just want to be allowed out.
Can I ask you, does India have a free speech constitution? I don't even know.
We do, but we have what are called reasonable restrictions, which are so broadly drafted that they can cover anything. And we also have the Information Technology Act, which has been amended and also has some new intermediary guidelines. And those are the ones that have been particularly difficult for India right now because they seek to censor anything. It's a very broad definition of what is caught, so that's one of the things he's been trying to protest about. It covers anything that's objectionable, which could be grossly harmful, disparaging. So people could be arrested for something being disparaging. I think I've actually got a slide of the terms. So, yeah, so these are the things that are actually covered. So ethnically objectionable, I mean, what does that even mean? You know, harassing. So, and impersonating another person. You know, you can impersonate somebody else.
people, it's institutional criticism.
No, but it's...
I'm talking about what that person did. Institutional criticism, this seems to be particularly directed toward individuals.
This is, yeah, I was just, you were asking if we had free speech legislation, so...
How do they define sedition, for example?
Sorry?
How do they define sedition?
Disparaging national symbols and national emblems. So, and there's also a National Emblem Act under which he was caught. So he's been caught under a couple of different things. But even the girls who were arrested first under the Criminal Procedure Code, which talked about inciting violence and communal hatred. Then they changed that to another section. Then they changed it to the IT guidelines under these rules that I just mentioned. So we technically have constitutionally protected free speech. We have Article 19(1)(a) of our Constitution, which is about freedom of speech and expression. But all of our, it's in a chapter in our Constitution called the Fundamental Rights chapter, kind of like the Bill of Rights. But it's all tempered and diluted by this idea of reasonable restrictions. And unfortunately, we have very, very broad notions of what that might be. So national security can trump everything. Incitement to violence can trump everything.
There's been action against efforts to portray the lives of previous prime ministers if they had affairs and things like that. So things that are considered to be insulting to the image of India.
Yeah, and in fact, there were other cases where Google and Facebook have been taken to court over objectionable material because there were cartoons that made fun of the prime minister. So, I mean, they could have gone under defamation law. The politicians weren't doing anything. What was particularly ironic was it was journalists who were actually filing these matters before court. So we've had 21 ISPs and companies who've been taken to court, and in delivering the judgment, one of the judges in the Delhi High Court said something like, if you don't take down all this objectionable content voluntarily, we can make you. Don't forget, India can also be like China, you know, which was a really weird analogy. And also, this, you would think that, you know, someone who was in one of the fundamentalist parties or somebody else might say this. This is actually our Minister for Information and Technology. This is the guy in charge of regulating the internet, for protecting free speech. And he's actually called Facebook and Google and a whole bunch of Indian ISPs, and he's tried to talk to them saying that he actually wants them to pre-censor, not just, you know, take down content later. And Google, for example, has given in a private memo explaining all the things it finds wrong with these intermediary guideline rules, and other people have been protesting against these rules. So what's been really, sorry.
I just want to ask, when the government goes after journalists, how does it tend to happen? Is it top-down? Is it people on the prosecutorial level? Or, as you say, mostly other journalists filing complaints?
Sometimes it's other journalists filing complaints, either saying their sentiments were violated, so then it becomes a personal action, so they take it to the court. Sometimes it's the government, and what the government often does, it won't go after the individual, it'll go straight to the ISPs and say, you block the content, or you take this down. And the Center for Internet and Society in Bangalore, whom I'm a fellow with, actually, when these guidelines came out, everyone said, what does this even mean? You know, these words are so vague. We don't know how to interpret them. We don't know how to actually implement them. So the CIS did this little sting operation where they sent completely fake letters to a whole bunch of ISPs complaining about content, saying, oh my God, this really offends me and this upsets me. Can you take this down? And in 6 out of 7 cases, there was over-compliance, either because the companies were so small that they just, you know, didn't want the hassle, they didn't want to be in trouble with the government, they didn't want their telecoms licenses being affected, or they just didn't have the money for a lawyer and they didn't want to waste their time seeing whether they even needed to respond to these notices. So it was one of the interns in the CIS. It was like, you know, this 18-year-old kid sent all these notices, and we had this huge flurry of activity. Everyone was taking down all this stuff, and they didn't just take down the objectionable comment, they actually took down all 56 comments and the article that people were commenting on. So there was huge amount of overcompliance just because people didn't know what these guidelines meant. And what's been really interesting is that India can be quite passive when it comes to resisting things, but I think this has really hit a chord, and even in, you know, even the gang rape case that happened recently has, you know, made people wake up in a way that a lot of things haven't. And there are a lot of things that the cartoonists and some other journalists have established an NGO that does a lot of work around free speech, and they've been launching a whole series of actions. So in the good old tradition of Gandhi, the first one was a freedom fast. So people actually were launching a hunger strike protesting against gagging on the internet. The minister who made that ridiculous comment about, wanting to censor everything, that's him here. And on April 1st, they decided that, they actually turned it into Wish Kapil Sibal Day instead of April Fool's Day, saying he's the biggest fool we know in trying to regulate something that can't be regulated and that it doesn't lend itself to being gagged. So if he's the biggest fool in India, let's wish him today. So happy, Fool's Day. So they actually had these protests all over India. And they had this wonderful sort of art project, which was Freedom in the Cage, which again brings us back to Foucault and cages. You had a whole bunch of students in cages symbolically protesting. So you had people using their laptops inside the cage. You had people playing music inside the cage, singing songs of protest, using Facebook, drawing cartoons, all kinds of activity that was meant to be stifled in some way. And Save Your Voice is the name of the NGO that the cartoonist runs, along with another journalist. So for me, it's very heartening to see that people are actually, finally saying, oh my God, this is something that really affects us. And Anonymous has also been doing a lot of work in India. They've been putting out these videos. I didn't want to put in another video, but it's really funny for me because you have some of the videos where it's clearly someone with an American accent, talking to Indians and telling them to wake up and what they need to do about, the IT Act or the guidelines or different things. And then the most recent one has a very, very Indian voice being masked, and with sort of obfuscating voice masking software. It's really funny because you can still hear the Indian accent behind all of it. I kind of wonder whether there should be a different mask for India because we have a huge tradition of masks in theater. And I would actually love to do a project sort of indigenizing Anonymous for India, much as I would like to do a project doing the pizza delivery ad for India, but with some particularly Indian delicacy, because I think that's a really effective way to get the message across. And maybe in the next 3 months I'm here, I could get some grad students to do that with me. That would be really fun. So I just wanted to sort of do a little airplane view of all the things that have been happening in India and the sort of movements and the protests that have come about. So I thought that was enough for now, but if people have questions, I'm very happy to talk about any of these aspects a little more. Rebecca actually knows more about all this stuff than I do.
No, not at all. But I just have a question because you mentioned that Google and some of the other international companies have been pushing back against some of these demands. What about the Indian companies? Have they begun to push back at all or to ally themselves with?
So actually that's kind of interesting because I usually don't end up defending Facebook and Google in a public forum, but in the Indian context, I actually think they play a very different role than, being on the privacy side, I don't normally like what they do, but what's interesting is because they have a global presence and they're used to dealing with these issues in so many different countries, they're a lot harder to push. And they actually push back, so when people come back, when the government files cases, they'll try everything in the book to not put down the content. They'll claim jurisdiction issues. They'll say, oh, we're registered in Delaware. We're not amenable to Indian jurisdiction. They'll try that. Then they say, no, actually you are. You need to come here and answer to people. You have an office here. And then they'll go, well, we don't think we don't do this anywhere else in the world, so we're not going to do it here. So Facebook and Google actually push back either because they have the deep pockets to do it, because they have the global experience, they have the legal teams, the compliance knowledge. So they actually push back more than Indian companies do. But I think watching what's happening, Indian companies feel a little bolder instead of hanging on to the coattails going, okay, well, if that's what they're doing, we'll try doing it too. Whereas otherwise, a lot of the smaller ISPs cave in almost instantaneously. You just send them a notice and they go, okay, fine, it's off. So I find that there was a very big gap between what the multinational companies would do and what the Indian companies are doing. But I think that's actually changing as they see more of a pushback. And I think as more and more egregious events happen, I think there are people within these companies who are standing up and going, hang on a minute, now this is getting ridiculous. So I think we're going to see more of resistance, but I think so far the Indian companies have been fairly quick to give in, largely because they don't understand what they're supposed to do and not do.
I want to mention that Nandan Nilekani, who basically set up Infosys, now has ministerial status to lead the charge to produce the UID, the Universal Identifier. So it's not quite, it's worse than I think the picture that you're painting. Our corporate bureaucracies are just as over-compliant as our politicians are in thinking the worst of individual users.
So actually I've been working on this internet policy with Internews in DC, and I've just been to India, and we've been, one of the streams of work we've been doing is actually interviewing a whole bunch of actors and stakeholders. And I actually met with the head of the body that actually regulates this Information Technology Act, who's famously reclusive and he doesn't really meet people, but I think Penn opened doors that my own name didn't, because he's like, oh, you're from America, you know. And he actually was, he usually doesn't talk to the media because he's really, really fed up of being portrayed as the big bad bogey in the whole internet game. And he actually, I mean, it was quite frightening. I mean, and this is the disconnect, right? He's a really, really nice man. He understands technology. He's not your Gulshan Rai. So he's not the usual inept politician. But at the same time, whenever I talked about issues of free speech, he'd get really angry and he'd sort of yell at me saying, what free speech? When people don't have food on their tables, who cares about free speech? And this is sort of this dichotomy that really bothers me in India, that it's always a zero-sum game. It's always either or. It's always privacy versus security, privacy versus, you know, Maslow's hierarchy or whatever. It's always, there's always something overarching that trumps civil liberties, you know. And he's the person responsible for regulating it and for actually implementing these horrendous draconian sections under the law. And his personal view is that, you know, who needs free speech? Who cares about it? And I find that incredibly problematic. And he also made comments about how he said free speech is not without restrictions. If you shoot me, I'll shoot you back. And I'm going, yeah, but you know, free speech on the internet is slightly different from someone actually being shot, but he didn't seem to think so. He said you need to have rights. Sorry.
Just wondering if there's like an economic discourse that this is all coupled with.
There is.
Legitimizing.
There is. So there are sort of two economic discourses. One is about how things like all the e-governance plans, and especially the ID program, are going to hugely cut cost of service delivery. They're going to cut down corruption, and it's going to be inclusive. It's going to be fantastic. It's going to cut out the middlemen. It's going to, you know, transform every kind of delivery. And that I find kind of disingenuous, because it's not the ID that's responsible for all these systems not functioning. So solving the identification problem, to me, isn't solving everything else. So if you solve the ID question, you're still dealing with bad service delivery, bad transportation, bad logistics, you know, corrupt politicians. So I think solving just identity without solving everything else doesn't really change as much. But also in the context of doing this, they keep saying, oh, the ID card will solve everything. But a lot of economists are going, really, you keep talking about saving, how much? And where is this coming from? And you know, you keep talking about corruption and leakage. How much corruption, how much leakage, how is this ID card going to solve it? So there hasn't been any real, there hadn't been any real cost-benefit analysis done before rolling out the project, but now there are being studies that are being rolled out. And there are also people at NYU who are helping with this. And one of my friends is actually working on it as well, so we haven't spoken recently. But so that's one sort of economic discourse. The other one is around making people accountable. Because when, I mean, I've been in meetings with Nandan, and you know, they went through this sort of beauty parade of trying to talk to civil society and do the right things and tick the boxes, saying, oh yeah, we've talked to them. But they invited very moderate people, or they invited people who they listened to but then weren't really going to do anything about. And one of the questions that people kept asking him was, what about the cost? What about the cost? What was the economic incentive for this? What is the justification for it? And he was quite polite in the beginning, but by the afternoon he really lost his temper, and he said, why are you giving me all the grief about cost? Do you know how much the Indian government spends on, for example, high school education or primary school education? And he rattled off all these impressive figures about, in the last 12 months, the government spent blah, blah, blah on primary education and spent so much on textbooks and so much on this. And why don't you give them grief about that expenditure, which is 20x what my budget is? Why don't you rail against the government for those costs? And the person moderating the panel, who is actually a very old environmental activist and who's been there, done that, sort of looked at him in this almost avuncular fashion and said, could it be, Chairman, that the benefits of education are not in doubt in the way that your project might be? And that sort of shut him up. But so yeah, there are sort of two streams of economic discourse going on.
We had talked about this before, but I was wondering if you could kind of go into a little bit of detail about kind of the scale of the project as a public works project in one sense, and also how that kind of folds into India's identity as emerging IT power in the global economy.
Yeah, so I think, if it was purely an Indian project, I think it would bother me, but I wouldn't necessarily be talking about it in an international context. The reason I think it actually has global implications is because a lot of countries are waiting and watching to see what we do with this scheme. And it's actually intended to be an exportable product. And during our WikiLeaks saga, we actually found cables from Hillary Clinton to the embassy in Delhi saying that the US government is very interested in monitoring this project and to see what's going on, and that they would like updates on a frequent basis from the US embassy in Delhi. And similarly, I know a lot of other countries are actually looking at this saying, we'll wait and see how it works. And if the whole thing doesn't break, we might want to consider having it in our countries. And India is advising, I think, Papua New Guinea and Indonesia and a couple of other countries on ID projects. So I think it could be a marketable thing that can just be commoditized and sold to other countries. Oh yeah, so one of the things, one of the statistics that Nandan loves to bandy about is how quickly they're going through it, because he's been facing a lot of criticism recently that it's not being done quickly enough, that people are waiting 6 to 9 months to get their letter saying this is their ID number. And he was trying to justify actually how quickly they're doing this. And he said, we're scanning so many people a day. And he said, we could do Finland in 4 days, and we could do Iceland in 2, and we could do Scotland in 6. And so, they are actually proceeding at this ridiculously rapid pace in actually enrolling people. So it's only been around for a year and a half, and we've got 270 million people enrolled, and we'll have 1.2 billion enrolled.
Yeah, who, if anyone, in the Indian government or the Indian power structure is on the side of the angels in the sense of being hostile to surveillance and pro-free expression? Is there a party? Are there prominent political leaders who really voice the other side?
There isn't a party as such built around these principles. I mean, there is one recently that's coming across, and Mr. Kejriwal is trying to come up with this thing called the Aam Aadmi. Yeah, that's the kind of the reaction that usually has in India. The Aam Aadmi Party, which is, Aam Aadmi is literally common people. But it's also funny because Aam in Hindi is also mango. So we've called them the mango people. But yeah. So there isn't a party built on these agendas. And I think each party is completely opportunistic in the way that they are for or against certain schemes, depending on whether they're in the opposition or in power. There are prominent people. So there's Rajiv Chandrasekhar, one of the MPs in the Rajya Sabha, which is our upper house, who's been very, very vocal, who's actually, and we have something called, it's kind of like class action suits, but it's a category of actions called public interest litigation, where the notion of standing is completely removed. So you don't need to be an affected party or a victim in order to file this. So India has been very proactive in action. And the other interesting thing is courts can actually, of their own volition, take up actions that they think ought to be action, but no one's brought a case before us, so we'll just do it ourselves. So there have actually been a few public interest litigations that have been filed and that this MP is involved in, protesting against these IT rules. And there's a completely barking mad ex-colonel in Bangalore who's been vociferously protesting against the ID card. So he's got a lawyer and a whole bunch of activists together. But politically, there's nobody actually aligning around these as a sort of party agenda.
In the artistic community, film directors, writers, intellectuals, anybody prominent?
There are, it's nobody doing particularly visible work as such. I mean, I couldn't single out anyone.
I'm sorry, Mark. I guess the question is the idea itself a free speech question as it's being positioned in India or by you, or is it this implementation question? In other words, that's the question I was asking originally, which is, okay, this is a reformist measure. If it were properly implemented, okay. I think that's the question I have, which is, how are you framing it? How is it largely framed in Indian society? And is it already a political decision that's been made? That is to say, it's been approved, they're moving forward.
And you're talking about the ID, not
just
all
the
the
ID.
other. Yeah. So in India, there are protests on various grounds. One is that it's too expensive and a poor developing country can't afford it. So there's one.
Should reverse the whole thing, or
some people are saying cancel the whole project.
Yeah.
Then there's one bunch of people who are saying the whole project is unconstitutional because technically this never went to Parliament, which is really, really remarkable. All of this money is being spent, subcontracts are being awarded, people are going door to door taking data. None of this has been officially sanctioned. So the Prime Minister is in favor of it. It's being done under the Planning Commission. So it's all executive authority, but it hasn't gone, or rather it went to, it didn't go to Parliament at all for a while, and then people kept saying, but this isn't legal, you can't go and collect data, on what grounds are you doing it? So they proposed a bill before the Parliament, which was hugely flawed, but at least they did try and go and legitimize, even the authority was not set up as a statutory body. So they went and put this bill before Parliament, and Parliament actually threw it out. And the Standing Committee on Finance, they published a really a pretty strong opinion while throwing it out, saying that they actually said, we're not just saying take away the bill and go and look at it again and come back with some drafting changes. We're actually asking you to go and examine whether this project should exist at all and whether we need to do this. So there's one camp which says it's unconstitutional, we don't even need this. And there's one camp which says it's going to cost too much money, we can't afford it. And there's a whole camp which says ID is fine, but the way that the system has actually been designed has so many flaws that it's not going to work. It's actually creating new levels of fraud. Because, for example, we have this chicken and egg problem, because in order to enroll, you need to show some documentation saying you are who you are. Some people don't have that, which is why they want the ID in the first place. So India's tried to be creative and inclusive, saying, you know what, we need to, so Nandan will keep saying, we need to lower the standards because it's a social welfare project. So we shouldn't be technical about these things. We should, lower the bar so everyone can be brought into the system. So they've introduced what's called an introducer system. So if you can't prove you are someone, you can actually get someone to introduce you and say, oh, I know this person, they're my neighbor or my daughter or whatever, and help them get their ID. There's already a huge black market in saying, I know you, old friend. We used to drink together in high school. And there's actually a doctor in Delhi who was arrested because he was giving fake letters to all of his patients with the best of intentions, thinking that his patients who were of the lower economic brackets would actually benefit from having this ID. So he thought, okay, what's the gap? What's preventing them getting it? Oh, they don't have an introducer. So I'll give them one. So he was handing out these letters for a fee, of course. And so he was actually arrested for doing this. So there are actually and so one of the pictures that the ID authority loves to show is when they're showing why, people have said, well, we've got other forms of ID, why do we need this? What's different about this one? They love showing this picture of someone who got an electoral, a voter ID card with a picture of his dog. So they keep showing this, saying that wouldn't be possible if you used biometrics. Biometrics will solve all of this. Someone in my state has actually got a UID, this unique ID biometric thing, with a picture of a head of broccoli. So, there are implementation issues that a lot of people are railing against. And for example, a lot of the people in the free software community or the more techie bodies that would normally be fighting this project, when I've talked to them, they just say, oh, it's not going to work, I don't need to protest, it'll just collapse on its own. Which I think would be a shame, because you've invested a whole bunch of money that the country can't afford to spare on a project that would get killed because it didn't work, or once it gets cancelled, the data is already out there. to me, that's terrifying that you've already collected so many people's biometrics, and then either due to change of political will or because they say that it's become too expensive now, so like what England did, they just cancelled it. But England actually destroyed the entire database. That would be very hard to do in India when the database is not one database. It's billions of databases sitting in this, dislocated fashion across a whole bunch of computers all over the country.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to get a sense. So, what other forms of national ID exist in India?
We don't have a national ID.
So there's no other national ID. No. So I mean, your sense when you say it's worrisome, is it because it's biometric? Is it because, I mean, I see the catch-22 that people want an ID because evidently an ID facilitates a bunch of things.
Yeah.
Stateless people have a lot of problems precisely because they don't have an ID. Kurds, Palestinians, Armenians until recently and all that.
Sure.
But so I'm not sure what, I mean, capturing data and information about citizens is historically part of state formation.
Yeah.
Is historically how nation states consolidate themselves. And India is in a stage of that process, right? And so I'm not sure what the objections are that it is, so it's not that it's biometric. The objection is that it's mere existence. I mean, I know you've kind of touched upon this. And I think it should be debated whether it's objectionable to have a national ID or not. Because most countries in the world do have it.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. in some sense is an exception, and some other countries are exceptions. But so I want to get a sense of you of at what level are the objections made.
The reason I didn't go into all the details about the ID thing is because I'm actually giving another talk which is all about the ID project. So so I actually mentioned this as one of the plethora of schemes that are creating a battle around free will in India. But I mean, I'm happy to. I mean, when I do that, I'll actually describe the schema of the project, the legal basis for it, how it flows into the census exercise, how it impacts citizenship. So I've actually got all of that in another presentation, which I can do. But
I think you can still answer the basic question, which is, is part of state building having such a system?
Yeah. So I think the objection in India is that if it was purely an extension of the census exercise, which in India the census is a confidential exercise, and it's meant to provide a snapshot of a population, it's meant to have anonymized information, it's demographics to help govern, it's all information in the aggregate, and it can't be shared with anyone. We have a protection against sharing it with anyone. But what they've done with this scheme to avoid that is they've actually done it under something else. So they've actually gone under the Citizenship Act. They've amended the Citizenship Act to allow for these rules to be collected. And the thing is, this isn't just the only ID project as well, because there's also something called the National Population Register. So there's also a turf war going on around, do we have the UID, do we have the National Population Register, do we do both? So that's been another whole battleground. So there have been issues around whether you need one at all. There have been questions around if you have one, should it have biometrics? Then the other issue is, should it be voluntary or mandatory? So the reason that I think a lot of people are finding this particularly fraught is because they say it's voluntary, but they're signing up to actually link it to every single thing that you would need to survive. So you can't get a mobile phone without this. You won't be able to open a bank account without this. So I think having an identifier that makes you visible to the state as saying X is X is very different from actually having a number that can then be used across your entire life and in every single sphere of activity. So
what's the difference between that and the Social Security number in the U.S.? I'm trying to get a sense of from the systems that I'm familiar with to understand.
No, and also I think we're looking at the fact that in Europe, for example, having an ID card is no big deal. People carry one around all the time. They don't find it particularly sinister. So I think because you have a very strong data protection and privacy environment, it's not seen as that frightening because there are only certain things you can do with it. But I think in India, there's a fear that we don't have the framework of laws that would protect this, because we have a few clauses in our IT Act, but the difficulty with that is because it's the IT Act, it only covers online data. So if your systems are maintained offline, as most things in India are in government offices, paper records aren't protected. So that's one big disconnect around how this data would be protected. But because of this, we've actually been now talking about implementing a new data protection law. So there's been drafts floating around. And India's actually set up a parliamentary subcommittee to look into whether India needs a dedicated privacy law, as opposed to, this hodgepodge of little bits and pieces across different legislation that may protect health data. I mean, kind of like the US system where it's all sectoral and it's, medical data and financial data all protected differently. So I think some of the arguments people are coming up with is, if you could solve that problem, maybe the card isn't so, maybe the ID isn't objectionable. And I changed it specifically because it's not going to be a card, it's just a number. And the reason they're not having a card is because they thought a card could be more easily spoofed. And they also thought that a card has many more surveillance state, Big Brother kind of implications of being asked to constantly produce it and keep re-identifying yourself to the state. Whereas they thought just a number would be more helpful, which is great. But then people are saying, but I'm not going to remember a 12-digit number, what do I do? And Nilekani, with clearly not enough sense of world history, said, well, why are people worried? They can just tattoo it onto their forearm. And you're going, you didn't just say that.
Or have
really
the chip
Yeah.
in the wrist.
There's also a philosophical reason. I think we're giving up too much if we say that one of the natural functions of state formation is to aggregate information quite like this on individuals. Because in fact, from what little I understand of these things, there is a huge variation between the kinds of freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution and the functioning of the state machinery. Very often the job of the state in the last 60 years in independent India has been to whittle down the kinds of freedoms and possibilities that are enshrined in the constitutions. And so civil society organizations, including the one that you're affiliated with, are always pushing back, trying to remind the state in India that its job has been mandated by a constitution that its everyday procedures are constantly militating against. So there's a problem of political philosophy and governance here, not just a question of not having just the right kinds of legal modalities that will govern and keep separate our databases from each other.
I'm wondering if international financial institutions and donors and international NGOs working in development practitioners, if they've come out with positions on this program, and have they been supportive or in opposition, and does it even matter for what's going ahead?
I think it's kind of awkward for people because a lot of funding that I've seen coming into NGOs, they don't specifically want to be identified with funding this. They want to keep it fairly quiet because they don't want it to be seen as sort of American interventionism in domestic affairs.
Funding opposition to the idea. Is that
Yeah.
or did you mean funding support or both?
Well,
ways?
like, so is the IMF or the World Bank saying this is a great program, or is USAID or the EU, even if they're not providing funding, have they said, this is a problem or this is great?
No, I'm not aware of any actual statements that they've made, but I mean, The Economist is all over it saying what a great project it is. There are, Nilekani is always talking at various venues about what a great project it is, and I think there's a huge disconnect between people lauding it as a great development project and people pulling it apart for other technical and security and privacy measures. But I think there's also another huge debate going on within the NGO community about whether it actually, this whole goal of inclusion is actually really not served by the project, that actually you're going to get exclusion because people are going to be identified and segregated and judged based on being in a system, whereas right now they have certain freedom by being anonymous. And for example, one of the weirder conferences I spoke at recently was a bunch of NGOs in India that work with LGBT issues. And they were very curious about this because in trying to be inclusive, the project has, for gender, you can either be MF or T for transgender. So they were actually trying to appeal to minorities, trying to get more people into the program. So they actually had this debate around whether that's a good idea or whether it's actually going to then have a very neat database where all these people can then be, violated in different ways. And when I spoke to them about this, we were debating this scheme, some of the questions that came out were so weird that I'm sure policymakers and the government couldn't possibly have legislated for all of this. For example, someone, these were not lawyers, these were not educated people. They weren't, social scientists. They were people from the LGBT community. Some of them were illiterate. Some of them, didn't speak English, and they were being translated, and they were asking just questions around, how does this affect me? And one woman stood up and she said, well, I went and registered for this thing, and apart from the fact that the police used it as an opportunity to frisk me, for 35 minutes before deciding what gender I was, which is a whole different story. She said, I've now gone and given them all my thumbprints, but I'm having hormonal replacement therapy and I'm going through the whole process of changing into a man. What is that going to do to my fingerprint? Is it going to grow? Is it going to change? And if that causes a high false, there's been a lot of debate around false acceptance and false rejection rates within the biometrics, and how actually the error percentages that may be okay in a smaller population go completely out of the water when you're dealing with a scale like this. So actually the errors are so significant that you could have millions of people being rejected from the system or being falsely accepted. And she said, so what is that going to do? Every time I try and identify myself, am I going to keep getting thrown off the system because my fingerprint has changed? And I know, have they found a way for me to change my fingerprint once I'm in the system? And then someone else turned up and said, I'm entitled to certain kinds of land and inheritance because I'm the oldest son in my family. Under Hindu law, I'm entitled to blah, blah, blah. So when I turn into a woman, do I need to give that all up? And if I'm registered for the ID as a man and then I change to a woman, what happens? So, there are all these weird edge cases where you're just not quite sure how the ID may actually discriminate against you rather than actually including you. And I think a lot of NGOs in India are working on very small focused issues like this. There are people who are fighting the whole scheme and saying the whole thing should die, or it should be recast with certain safeguards and it should be turned into a better scheme because it actually does have some useful functions. But equally, there are people saying the second you start enumerating a population, you're just opening Pandora's box in terms of what the government can do. Because, for example, when we had electoral ID cards, which is the closest thing we've had to a sort of national ID, a lot of the riots that happened in Gujarat between Hindu and Muslim factions were mediated by the voter's ID card, which had people's addresses, and they look, and when you're talking about a Hindu-Muslim tension, it's very easy to identify through people's last names what they are. So you don't even need to have a tab saying, religion. You just look at every, Ali and Khan in the book and you say, oh, that's where they live. Oh, there are lots of them in this area, so that's a Muslim area, we'll go target that one. So those kind of uses of electoral data, misuses rather, people are very nervous that with an ID like this, which is actually, it's not even just people who vote, it's every single person who lives in India, that it can actually be misused, in a monumentally horrific way.
How is the discourse being represented in mainstream media over there?
I think, so one of the things I'm interested in studying is exactly that, and largely influenced by Monroe's classes about narratives and building strategic narratives. I'm trying to look at how that discourse is actually being portrayed. And one element is this constant zero-sum game kind of, framing things as either or. So it's you can either have privacy or security. You can either have privacy or transparency. And because there's a huge, privacy is kind of a fairly new idea in India. Transparency is something that's had huge benefits and has had a huge political movement behind it for the last few years. So transparency is seen to be such a big goal that when you start protesting about data being out there, people go, but data is good, open data is good, open government is good. So there is a huge tension. So I think that's one of the themes that you keep seeing, that who cares about privacy, it's more important to be transparent. You need to expose the government. But I think with a lot of these framings, you have a sort of parallax error because it's one person's privacy versus someone else's, national security or someone else's transparency. So I think they don't quite match. And I think one of the interesting themes in the media is about this whole culture. Indians are not private. We don't have a culture of privacy. Who cares about it kind of thing. And one of the things I'm looking at in my PhD is how true that is. Is it just that we're not private, or that what we consider private and public are just cast differently, or that the line between public and private is drawn somewhere else? So I think these cultural notions keep coming up, and even with the other sort of free speech issues, the cultural thing keeps coming up, saying, oh, we're not like the West. We're not like, like with the gang rape things. People were saying, oh, it's because, people dress in an enticing fashion and they asked for the usual, they asked for it. Sorry?
They say that here.
Oh, no, they say that here too. But I think with the gang rape case, a lot of people were saying, but I walk around in a sari, and I still get molested on a daily basis. So, don't give me this whole Western values thing. So I think there is that whole theme that's coming out as well.
Thank you very much, Malavika. We look forward to.
Thank you.